Hello, and thank you for joining our Teaching for the 21st Century webinars brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang. I am your host, Annie Cyrus, and now our very, very special guest tonight. We have Jack Posobiec. He is a One American News correspondent and a former Navy intelligence officer. Jack, thank you so much for your service, and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Well, Annie, I really appreciate you having me on tonight. And obviously, during this trying time here in the United States, while we deal with lockdowns, while we deal with the economic turndown, as well as the ever-rising death toll, I think there's a lot of people who are asking questions as to how this thing got started, why we're in the situation that we're in. Why did it seem like some of the governments of the world were really caught flat-footed here? And quite frankly, where to point the blame and what direction to look. And what I would like to try to outline tonight is how this started in China, why the communist government is set up in the way that it is, why they acted the way that they did, and what steps did they take, in fact, including some new information that's never before, I think, really been talked about on a higher level, the steps that they took to actually hinder the worldwide response to this virus.
And we are anxiously waiting to hear all your thoughts.
All right, so one of the biggest indicators of this entire thing was all the way back in November. China realized that they had a problem. They started getting a virus, they started getting patients in who had a virus that was flu-like, and yet they knew it wasn't the flu. Now, China in East Asia is a major believer in something called face, this face culture. It's almost like an honor culture, but it's based around the idea of a reputation. Now, in Western cultures, the prevailing attitudes is for integrity, honesty, transparency, these openness. These are all the sort of values that we uphold. But in China and other Eastern cultures as well, there is a propensity to place more emphasis on reputation, on upholding your reputation, upholding another's reputation. It's almost seen as a failure on yourself to diminish someone's reputation without cause, or to do so publicly without cause. So what does this mean for the Chinese Communist Party? Well, the Chinese Communist Party is a dynasty in China, if you look at it in terms of Chinese history. My own background, I lived in China for 2 years. I've been traveling back and forth from there for about 15 years at this point, even though I may not look it. I speak fluent Mandarin, and I was a Mandarin linguist while I was in the United States Navy. China was a major area of focus of mine also in the Navy for not all of my deployments, but a majority of them, and a majority of the work that I did. And so understanding the mindset of the Chinese government, of the party, which is really synonymous with the government and the military and business leaders in terms of China, because all key leaders in China are members of the party. That's something that I really think we need to drive home more and more in the Western discussion, because there are no key leaders. There aren't allowed to be key leaders in China that rise to a certain level without the blessing of the party. And so that brings us to Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping rose to power in China back in 2012. And what's actually interesting is that prior to 2012, following the outbreak of SARS, China actually had been opening up to the world and had been plugging in with a lot of international systems in terms of medicine, because the international community had recognized that China was sort of a hotspot for these possible pandemic outbreaks. And so under previous Chinese presidents, or chairman actually, as they're referred to in Mandarin, they don't even say the word president because they're obviously not elected. They were working together with the US CDC as well as the French to build this lab out in Wuhan. That's why they're referred to as the Chinese CDC. There's a reason for that, right? It has the same name. And they had set in place a system of tripwires should another pandemic look like it was getting started. However, when Xi Jinping took power in 2012, he, for the first time in a very long time in China, started to institute a cult of personality around the leader. Now, this is something that hasn't been seen in China since the days of Chairman Mao. He instituted a gripping purge across all Chinese leaders that he viewed as rivals and that he viewed as possible opponents to him. chief of this is Bo Xilai. Now, Bo Xilai and Xi Jinping were both seen as princelings. Princelings means they're sort of the next generation of the Communist Party. They're the direct descendants of the leaders, the senior leaders of the Communist Party with Mao, the long marchers, people who were with him for the fight, right, for the struggle against the imperialist Japanese and the imperialist Americans. And so because of that status and because of a similar background, so Xi Jinping was the leader of Shanghai. When I lived there, Xi Jinping was the general secretary of the city. I had occasion to meet him once, and at a sort of international function in the run-up to the Shanghai World Expo in 2010. And Bo Xilai was the leader of Chongqing. Now, Xi Jinping, when he first rose to power, he took out Bo Xilai. He exposed a whole boatload of corruption, an entire, as long as the Great Wall of corruption behind Bo Xilai, and threw both him and his wife in jail, probably for the rest of their lives. He did the same thing with a number of state level officials, provincial level officials, party officials across the country. He then reasserted his power over the military. He made sure that people who were loyal to him got all key military leadership roles. This was done to place himself, and as many people saw, in a position of being chairman for life, similar to what Chairman Mao had. Now, the problem with that is that that started breaking down that system of tripwires and that system of openness and transparency that had been put in place in China. Because now, when a new pandemic came out, the fear of being found out by this, of being potentially purged yourself, because if you were the doctor or the province or the official where this pandemic was breaking out, you then would be the one potentially being purged, potentially being detained. So when this thing first started coming out in November, in December, in Wuhan, the doctors that first realized it, that started seeing a mass influx of patients, they were very worried and they weren't sure what to do. One of the doctors, Li Wenliang, started posting messages inside a private chat group on the Chinese social media app called WeChat. And this was a private group. However, screenshots of those posts went viral on Chinese social media, and Chinese censors very closely or very carefully tried to take them down, but it was too late. It had gotten everywhere. They then arrested Li Wenliang. They detained him, arrested him, and forced him to sign a confession and apologize for spreading fear-mongering and rumors in China. And anyone who's studied China or who's lived there understand that to say that you're spreading rumors in China, it's almost akin with where we would consider treason in the United States or in the West. It's extremely negative because they are considered rumors against the party, rumors against the state itself. And that, again, they see no connection between Chinese whole of society approach. They take a whole of society approach to everything. So if you are spreading rumors, that means you are against society, you are anti-society. It's sort of, almost like they call people antisocial, but it has much more legal ramifications in China. Li Wenliang, many people will know the story. He later actually contracted COVID himself and died. Now, since then, China has obviously, by the end of January, acknowledged that the pandemic was taking place. They ordered lockdowns, massive lockdowns throughout Wuhan, and Li Wenliang's legacy has been rehabilitated. But for those key weeks in December and into January, that China did not take the action to lock down their cities and to lock down what was going on. They moved forward with a mass festival in Wuhan in the run-up to the Chinese New Year, the Spring New Year, Spring Festival. It's now been determined by a number of epidemiologists that had China started just 2 weeks earlier, 3 weeks earlier, they could have stopped this pandemic in its tracks. It would not have gone global the way that it did. But because they refused to take that measure, because they were following in those footsteps of trying to preserve their reputation, to preserve the legitimacy of their regime, and to shut down whistleblowers, essentially, as dissidents, they ended up infecting the entire world. And we're now just seeing tonight, by the way, there's a huge investigation that's been broken by Global News in Canada. And their investigation has put forward that the Chinese consulates, using an arm of the party that Xi has really expanded since his time in government, called the United Front Work Department. What does the United Front Work Department do? They have 40,000 agents, and their job is to maintain the reputation, the image, and the influence of the Chinese regime around the world. What were they doing? In mid-January, back when China was telling the world that this thing wasn't human-to-human transmissible, that it wouldn't break out as a pandemic virus, they were bulk buying N95s and PPE all around the world, and they were sending them back to China. So China was stockpiling N95s while they knew this thing was going to hit the rest of the world. And they were deliberately spreading misinformation to the rest of the world at this same time, because then the rest of the world had to turn to China. They were using resource control, when now China still, to this point, and we just saw Gavin Newsom spend over $1 billion to get N95 masks from China. This stockpiling they did was deliberate, and this is very key. So understanding the power of the regime, understanding the legitimacy of the regime, and the fact that China at this point, we've described China in the West, and China watchers have used this phrase for about the past 20 years since their ascension to the WTO, as a rising power, right? At this point, China has risen. China is competing for superpower status, period, full stop. They are directly competing with the United States for that status, and they have not reformed their government. They have not allowed for democracy. They have not allowed for liberalization. They have not allowed for freedom of speech, freedom of the press, or freedom of religion. The religious repression of Christians, of Muslims in China, of the Falun Gong is absolutely horrific, horrendous. Over 1 million Uyghurs are in detention camps right now because of this. And the Chinese regime has a much different plan for the world order than the one that is currently there. And so all of these reasons, and because of our own sort of short-sightedness, I would say, as a country, where we all thought it was wonderful for a long time to export our jobs overseas, to outsource our manufacturing base to China, because in turn we would receive massive profits. We'd all be able to get cheap, big screen Chinese TVs. We're at the point now where our pharmaceuticals are made in China. Our penicillin is made in China. Our antivirals, our antibiotics, the actual equipment for our hospitals is being made in China. China bulk bought the N95s so that they could maintain their influence throughout this entire thing. And I think it's really time for not only the United States, but for the West to re-examine this relationship and re-examine the behavior of the Chinese regime. They were given a chance. And I can tell you that the Trump administration, and we're hearing this from others, and by the way, this is bipartisan, absolutely bipartisan. There are a lot of people saying now that we need to, number one, find a way to receive some type of compensation from China in terms of this. And number two is we need to understand that we can't allow this situation to continue. It is an untenable position. China rose because we allowed them to, and because we helped them, we financed them. We outsourced our financial wealth to China for these 20 years, and we're now seeing how China is repaying it back to us.
I'm sorry, I'm speechless. I need a second to, wow.
And that's, by the way, not even to speak of China's military rise. So how has China used this wealth is they've dumped the majority of it into their military and their infrastructure. They've got bullet trains, they've got maglevs, they've got massive cities that they're building, even ghost cities in some cases, so they can keep their employment numbers up. And their military is expanding at a rapid pace, far more rapid than ours. And they're expanding their reach into obviously areas of the South China Sea where they're building their own man-made islands and laying claim to international waters. They're expanding their naval forces to the point where they're now building, they have one active carrier. They're building another one, an indigenous one. This will be their first indigenous carrier. They want to push out further and further across the Pacific to push the United States and its allies out of international waters to create that sort of Chinese influence zone that they once enjoyed over 100 years ago.
Again, wow. I have absolutely, compared to you, absolutely zero, but I have a little tiny bit of knowledge of China and Chinese system and all that. And as you said at the beginning, information that we don't hear anywhere, this normally goes in a sarcastic way of, I'm amazed that none of this mainstream media has ever reported about anything you just said as far as COVID-19, coronavirus, quarantine, all of that has been going on, I think, pushing about, what, 4 months now, 5 months now.
Right.
None of the things you've said, I have actually not heard a word of it. And I'm pretty sure there are many people who are willing to bet their life on the fact that this is all conspiracy and none of it is real.
Well, by the way, that bit about the N95s, you can go look. That's Global News out of Canada. They're a very respected mainstream outlet, middle of the road. This isn't right-wing talk radio talking point or something. I'm reading what their research says, and that it specifically goes back to that United Front Work Department. It specifically talks about their mobilization of overseas Chinese to stockpile the N95s during mid-January, as far back as mid-January, because they knew this thing was going to hit our shores, and they did it anyway.
Oh, no, I completely agree. My point was the American mainstream media, our channels here in America. I'm pretty sure somebody somewhere sent them the information. It
Well,
was
they're more interested in they seem more interested in whatever Trump tweeted about this morning, or did he talk about something that's not proven yet at the press conference and create some kind of drama with the White House. They'd rather talk about that than what's actually going on.
I was actually going to say that very thing. Let me quickly say to our audience, we have a couple of questions, but if anybody has any questions about what was said or anything that's related to COVID-19, China and all that, please feel free to put them on a Q&A box you see on your screen. But before we get to questions, I was just about to say, if they would say anything that you just said, then it would go against their own narrative that this is all Trump's fault. So they kind of have to
right, and it's kind of hard to lay the blame at the feet of the White House in terms of this. Now, certainly you could argue that you could say you're not a fan of the press conferences. I've seen people make that criticism, and that's perfectly fine opinion to have. I think the press conferences have been extremely open. I think in some cases that it's obviously been very combative, so I don't know if it's serving the purpose of just providing that information. But it's a two-way street, right? That's a two-way street. That being said, President Trump did actually, so I was the first person on, I think, almost all of social media, all the way back on January 22nd, because I was reading Chinese social media. I was seeing the videos coming out of Wuhan. I could see how dangerous this thing was. And then when I saw China start to lock down their cities, and I understood that this is, understanding China's face culture and understanding their concept of honor and reputation, that for them to admit that they had a problem that big was a huge red flag for me. I mean, this was a system blinking red kind of moment. And so when I saw China was willing to take that hit, both reputationally and economically, of closing down entire provinces of millions of people, that I said immediately, we need to institute a travel ban, stop the flights from China. I've got that up January 22nd. The White House does read me pretty closely. President Trump, retweeted me a number of times throughout the past few years. And then 9 days later, he did actually ban those flights from China and required anyone coming from China to put in a 14-day quarantine. Now, what ended up happening was, and they're starting to pull this out a little bit more, it looks like because Europe did not institute a travel ban on Chinese travelers, we ended up getting more of it, at least on the East Coast, from travel from Europe, because the virus hit Europe and then it hit us. Now, we're looking back, of course, into Seattle and California to see if they had some cases that came from that early Chinese travel.
amazing. I'm gonna go ahead and start some questions for you, Jack, because they are actually piling up and we would like to answer as many questions as possible. So the very first question I have is in two parts. So how reliable would Japan, Australia, and India be in any real showdown with the Chinese? Likewise, Vietnam. Edward Lutuk on War Room said that the Vietnamese are very much an ally of ours. How far would they be willing to go with us in any confrontation with the Chinese?
Well, if you look at Vietnam, Vietnam is the last country that's actually gone in 1979 to blows with China. They're the last country that's actually committed military forces to an active armed conflict with China. Now, this was a maritime dispute, And the Vietnamese won, actually, by the way. China was contesting them for some of those islands. Again, in the South China Sea, they were trying to enforce their will. They kind of look at it as their pond or their backyard in some cases. The Vietnamese had other designs, and so China had a sea lift problem at the time. They weren't able to supply their forces on the sea, whereas the islands they were taking were very close to trying to take were very close to Vietnam. Vietnam kicked their butts in that one. Plus, Vietnam has something that all of those countries that you just outlined don't have, and that is a land border with China, a very strategic land border with China. So that's why you've been seeing multiple missions of the US military working together hand in hand with the Vietnamese military, working to train up their forces, doing demining operations, working on, obviously there's a lot of unexploded ordnance in Vietnam because of the Vietnam War. That's something now that the US and Vietnam are directly working on, but at the same time, they are building that partner force capacity with the Vietnamese military. So I've actually traveled to Vietnam through some of this, and I can tell you the Vietnamese are no fans of China. China ruled Vietnam for about 1,000 years. For people who aren't familiar with East Asian history, Southeast Asian history, until, and then when they left, the French came in and everything else happened as we know of. But the Vietnamese have a long memory, and they view the United States as an ally that will help them against China. What's interesting is that Vietnam still retains that strategic alliance with Russia because of Russia's support during the Vietnamese War. And so it's this sort of interesting situation where the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And I got to tell you, I was there in Vietnam, and no, I was in South Vietnam, so the memories may not be as rough as in Northern Vietnam, but where the war was fought, or towards the sort of central area. But there was a lot of warmth towards Americans. They were very welcome to have us there. They definitely welcomed us with open arms. They appreciated what we were doing, and they were very, very concerned about coming again under the thumb of China. And to your point, by the way, India and Japan also view China in the exact same light. Japan was, sort of little brother to China for a very long time. Then World War II happened, so that reignited sort of the hostilities between China and Japan. Japan has been remilitarizing. They call it sort of reevaluating their defense policy as outlined by their constitution, which essentially we wrote after World War II, and they've been really building up their naval forces. India, on the other hand, while they don't share a substantial land border with China, of course, we have the Himalayas in between them, they do obviously stand as a major counterbalance to China because they are the only other country really on the planet that has the same population as China, or a comparable population to China. And so I know that certainly a lot of American companies are looking at potentially moving manufacturing from China to India. How China responds to that will no doubt be through hostility and anger.
Okay, next question. I'm sure it is a question for hundreds of people. Is the virus a bioweapon?
I haven't seen any indications of that. When I've talked to folks that are still in the intelligence forces, or my own, I have some family connections in the microbiology world, very closely with my mom. And everything that they've said is that if this were a weapon of some sort, the mortality rate would be much, much higher than what it is. A weapon we're talking about 90% mortality that we've been looking at, nowhere near as low as what this is. So that was one of the big things for them that made them look as though it probably wasn't something that was designed or man-made.
Interesting. Do you have any information on where the virus started?
Well, currently the United States intelligence agencies have decided, and there's a huge statement that came out this morning, so I'll defer to them on that, my own sort of alma mater, if you will. I was with ONI and DIA, and that they have decided that the wet market story that was spread by China early on in this thing has some holes in it. And so they're taking a very strong look at that Wuhan lab, that P4 lab that's just a few hundred feet from where the wet market was. This is China's repository of almost all viruses in China. What they do is they're collecting viruses from bats as far away as Yunnan, as far as almost 1,000 miles from Wuhan, even though similar names. And they're bringing them all to that Wuhan lab. And the State Department was writing cables about this years ago, after having done a few visits to this place, to say, look, they've got this massive repository of viruses, and they don't seem to be following international safety standards there in terms of keeping these viruses, and possibly also in terms of the ways that they're experimenting with them. Now, I would say that I think the experiments that are being done there are likely in good faith. They're looking for vaccines. Obviously, they're still looking for a vaccine for SARS. That's been something that's been out of reach for the world since the SARS outbreak happened. There's still been no vaccine for it, and vaccine for MERS as well. And so this is something that they had this one doctor, a female, they call her the Batwoman. And what she does is she actually collects coronaviruses, thousands of coronaviruses from or all around China, and then brings them back to that lab to study them. And so I think for the United States intelligence agencies, they're looking at as very interesting to say that, this is this mass repository of coronaviruses, and it's so close to where they believe that the coronavirus outbreak took place.
Okay, that bat lady is a little creepy, but what can be done?
No, you wouldn't catch me in those caves. I'll tell you right. Say that much.
No, I was actually just sitting listening as soon as you said that. I'm like, well, what can be done to stop China's advancements in the China Sea?
Well, there's a lot of things that can be done down there, and what's fortunate for us is that we actually do have a lot of partners in the South China Sea. The United States enjoys a very strong relationship with the Philippines that goes all the way back to 1898, when the U.S. liberated the Philippines from under the yoke of Spain. We've always had a strong relationship with the Philippines since then. There's been some, a few hurdles in that relationship. The naval base at Subic Bay, which the U.S. used, extremely often during, and extremely to great use during the Vietnam War. The U.S. was kind of kicked out of there in the 90s, but there are discussions to bring that back. That's something that started under the Obama administration. And we're very clear about this, that this isn't like a Trump versus Obama thing, because Obama was also pushing, I know I'm like a conservative, so I'm not supposed to say good things about Barack Obama, right? But this was something that was going on during the Obama administration, that they were looking at ways to get the U.S. military back into Subic Bay. They were looking at ways to increase our partnerships with Singapore. They were looking at ways to increase the training, the level of training and interoperability between the U.S. and Vietnamese. And so all of these areas surrounding the South China Sea, and obviously Taiwan, it's not really South China Sea, but it's, if you look to the north, they're obviously there. And as I believe it was Eisenhower who once said, or even Truman, that, Taiwan is really that floating aircraft carrier, the Republic of China, sitting right off of the coast of mainland China. And so our military relationship with the Taiwanese is actually quite strong in terms of selling them material. Now, obviously, the U.S. doesn't formally recognize Taiwan. Clearly, President Trump and the president of Taiwan have a very strong working relationship, and I think you're going to see more of that as things move forward. Recently there's sort of been this idea floated in a lot of those Southeast Asian countries about conducting joint patrols in order to counter what China is doing there with their warships. Obviously, the U.S. would be involved in that as well. So it's that power of multi-regional alliances and ASEAN is the name of the countries there, the alliance, plus American military strength that really could counter what China is doing. And again, by the way, the United States is not looking to assert U.S. control over this. They're looking to assert international law, because these are international waters. These are waters through which Chinese goods flow. There are waters in which obviously oil flows. China does not have a lot of oil supplies. Their energy supplies are very low. And so they're one of the world's largest importers of oil. They import a lot from Iran. All of that comes through the South China Sea. So certainly China has a strategic interest in the South China Sea. And for the 20 years, we've allowed them to participate in these ideas of upholding international law and international waters. But it's been China unilaterally that is pushing to control the South China Sea in contravention of international law.
That makes sense. It's China.
Of course.
Next question says, did the new trade agreement have a clause that China would not have to buy all the agriculture originally agreed to? if there were a hardship. Do you think China would try to get out of that deal using COVID-19?
Well, China's going to use any leverage that they could possibly find on other countries, and they're already doing with this with Australia. So we talked about just recently talked about how it was Canada that put out this huge expose on the Chinese overseas influence operation, but it's really been Australia that's sort of the canary in the coal mine on all of this, and of course Hong Kong, which is they sort of live they're in the mouth of the dragon themselves. But Australia is is a Western country. This is a Western infrastructure, Western government, Western culture, and they too have been influenced by the Chinese. They've suffered a lot of Chinese influence, intelligence operations, financial operations. And just last week or a few days ago, the Chinese were saying that if Australia continues to criticize China, Australia has called for an investigation of the WHO. They've called for an investigation of what actually happened to start with the origin of this virus. And they've said that they believe that Taiwan should be allowed back into the WHO. Scott Morrison, the MP of Australia. Taiwan, of course, back in December, and I really need to mention this, Taiwan informed the WHO in December that COVID-19 was human-to-human transmissible. The WHO ignored them. Why did the WHO ignore Taiwan when Taiwan obviously was dealing with the same virus as China? There is travel between China and Taiwan, quite a bit of it since Ma Ying-jeou's administration, the former president of Taiwan, who was seen as a little bit more pro-Beijing, at least in terms of an economic sense. But the Australians have said, to heck with it. We want an investigation of China. We want an investigation of the WHO. The way China has responded, they've said that they are going to stop buying agricultural products, specifically livestock, from Australia. They know that that is absolutely would cripple Australian farms, Australian farmers, Australian workers. That is Australia's one of their main export areas. Almost all the beef you get in Asia is coming from Australia, at least certainly the best cuts of it. And they know that that market is totally where Australia's economic footprint and economic focus is on. And so they know that that is the key leverage point. Remember, the Chinese still study Sun Tzu 2,000 years ago, or 2,500 years ago even, to this day. They will use any sort of influence on you that they can. And if they know that this is your key center of gravity, that they will hurt you monetarily. They don't necessarily need to fire shots. They didn't need to fire shots to remove our factories, to shut down our productions, to put Americans out of work, right? They did that financially. They did it all financially. And now they're looking to do the same thing to the Australian farmers. But Australia is standing strong. And I really think I would encourage the United States government to stand with Australia in terms of this.
Could this have been an intentional act of war? Chinese casualties there for plausible deniability?
I really don't think so. I really don't think that this is something that was intentional, because remember, China, as I laid out early on, China suffered a major reputational crisis point over this. They suffered billions of lost dollars in their economy, regardless of, certainly this isn't the first time that China has lost population over something that the Communist Party did. And this is the same Communist Party, remind you, that committed the Great Leap Forward, which killed at least on the low end 50 million Chinese peasants, and then still stands strong. Chairman Mao is still on every dollar bill, or excuse me, every Chinese yuan in China, right? Imagine if Germany still had Hitler on all the money, right? That's what China is today. They still have Chairman Mao. Deng Xiaoping came out and said his famous phrase of, Mao was 3 parts bad, 7 parts good. Very, very, very Chinese way of thinking. And so while I do see the thinking in that the Chinese regime wouldn't mind having casualties, it's that reputational aspect of it and the financial aspect of it that makes me really think that if there's anything this would be more akin to, it's probably Chernobyl. I really do believe that COVID-19 is China's Chernobyl.
What does all this mean for North Korea?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. And we of course got Schrodinger's Kim Jong-un right now because we're not sure if he's alive or dead. And so we've got, of course, Schrodinger, the cat in the box. We've got Kim Jong-un in the resort of Wonsan. Is he alive or dead? And the reports that I've been reporting at One American News, OANN.com. Please go check out OAN. Watch One American News, #1 news network in America. And got to get the plug in, of course. But Kim Jong-un has fallen ill. There were complications from surgery. That's what was put out by Taiwan News. I heard the same from my intelligence sources. One of those complications may have actually been contracting COVID-19 from Chinese surgeons that were flown in. That was something out of Beijing, military surgeons. That was something that's been reported as well. And so what it means for North Korea, believe it or not, would actually be a setback for US-North Korean relations. What I mean by that is President Trump, and like him or not, he has had major diplomatic breakthroughs with North Korea in a way that no Western leader has ever had. And any change in that movement and that forward progress would definitely be a tilt back towards China, back towards Beijing. That's what Xi Jinping wants. He wants that tilt back. And if the sister, Kim Yo-jong, ends up becoming the leader after Kim Jong-un, it's reported they have an older brother, but he's constantly eschewed leadership. He's actually into playing guitar and goes to Eric Clapton concerts from time to time. It would really be a wild card as to what could happen. There could be a much more hardline military presence that takes over the North Korean side of things. And at the same time, in South Korea has major ties with China. They have billions of dollars in trade that's going on right now. So the entire balance of the Korean Peninsula has shifted. It's not the 1950s anymore. They're not as, that land ramp into China isn't as important as is the economic relationships that they maintain. However, if Kim Jong-un does end up dying, that would be a major blow, I think, to those relations. And I do think you would see North Korea swing back towards Beijing.
Next question is from one of your followers, Suzanne. She said, I follow Jack closely on Twitter and have learned so much about China. He was way out in front of the start of the Wuhan virus. Now the question, are you worried about any possible retaliation from the WUMAS or China?
Well, on me personally?
Yes.
Oh, well, not while I'm in the United States. I think that would be a very brazen act of China to retaliate something like that. Remember, China, it's all reputationally driven. So if I'm out here as an American citizen, a military veteran, One American News correspondent, who's been very outspoken about China. So should China take any action against me, I think it would be more on an influence basis. I think it would be more reputational. I think one of China's ambassador actually has me blocked on Twitter because I was trolling him a little too hard, and but with facts and evidence. And really, though I will say this, I haven't in a couple of years gone back to China. So it'd be interesting to see if they've revoked my privileges for receiving a Chinese visa. I'll have to let you know the next time I apply for one.
We just have a little bit of time left. I think we can answer 2 more questions. So here's one more. Does China have a chance of winning this Cold War with us?
Of course. Absolutely. If America doesn't stand tall right now, and China continues their expansion of debt diplomacy, debt trap diplomacy, of 5G diplomacy, not only in Africa, not only in South America, in the Middle East, Central Asia, but in Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe. Greenland is a huge strategic focus point of this. Did you know that one of the largest mineral deposits in Greenland, right off of our shores, is currently their largest shareholder is a Chinese company out of Shanghai, right? They're buying up resources, they're buying up rare earth elements that we all need for our space programs, that we all need for our high technology, and they're going around the world and purchasing these things. So that's the situation we're in right now. And if the US allows all of these things to continue, then yes, China will come out on top of this thing. China will beat us in the space race. We're in a massive space race right now with China that nobody's really spoken to. And it's not so much about Mars as it is the asteroid belt. The asteroid belt and the potential trillions of dollars that are out there. And I'll lay down a marker right here. So please, it's April 30th, 2020. I'll tell you, the world's first trillionaire will make their fortune in space mining. And it's up to us to decide whether or not that is going to be an American or Chinese.
One last question, if you don't mind, that is my own question. This is not about COVID-19, but it is about China. So what is your take on how the Chinese government is dealing with Islam and Muslims in China?
That's so the Muslims in China are called Uyghurs, and the way China is dealing with them is horrific. It's oppression, and it's going to become a Muslim genocide if nothing is done about it. They've got over 1 million in concentration camps right now, where there's indoctrination that's going on, but there's also reports of organ harvesting going on in there. Now, to be clear, there have been some incidents of terrorism from among the Uyghur population in China. So the Muslim part of China is referred to as Xinjiang. In Mandarin, this means new border, because it was formerly referred to as East Turkestan. That was then taken over by China. They took over Tibet, they took over, expanded their territory. In the West, this is the former Silk Road area. Remember the Silk Road? That's what connected China with Rome and Europe and across Central Asia. So this is a Central Asian area. It shares a border with Afghanistan, believe it or not. It's where you saw the movie Kite Runner. They actually filmed it in Xinjiang. And what they're doing there to fight back again, and they're not just going after the people who committed terrorism, they're going after the entire population. And what's happening is absolutely wrong. And I fear that the world has turned a blind eye to what's going on in there. To this day, we don't know whether or not the virus has spread throughout those concentration camps, because we certainly haven't heard that anyone's being let out. We're even in the United States, and some people have great concern about it. I have great concern about it, but we are allowing prisoners out of prisons on their own recognizance, because we don't want people to be in prison because they obviously can't social distance, right? You're like all those sailors on the Navy ships that caught 1,000 sailors now from the USS Roosevelt. But those Chinese concentration camps for the Uyghurs and the Muslims have not been emptied to anyone's knowledge. And while they have them in there, they've been indoctrinating them, and they're putting them at massive risk of COVID-19. As people asked, is COVID-19 intentional? I don't know, but they are intentionally holding them in those camps, and they are intentionally putting them in harm's way. Absolutely.
And to add to what you just said, it has always been a question for me, why is it that the 50 Islamic countries are not coming to rescue these Muslims? Why are they not taking them in as refugees and saving them? But of course, that's a discussion for a complete different webinar. Jack, thank you so much for your wisdom, for your information. You were great. I personally learned a lot. Where can our audience follow you to learn more?
So the best place to follow me is to watch One American News. Go to oann.com. You can find it if it's available for your cable service in your local area. We also have a variety of streaming platforms. We're on Roku, Cloud TV, KLOWD TV is our own streaming platform. You can get that on your phone. You can get that on your tablet. You can watch that on your computer. It's a couple of bucks a month. We're on Facebook Live for a couple of bucks a month. So just go to oann.com and you can really catch all of One American News. I kind of cover down on the China front and North Korea, so East Asia, but we're also right there in the White House every day. They actually tried to kick us out of the White House briefings, but we fought back and we didn't allow that to happen. Because the White House Correspondents Association, the other mainstream media, they don't like us very much, because we have this little problem where we don't necessarily follow along with the mainstream narrative. And we actually have independence and free thinking, where we're not beholden to any one agenda other than the truth. So please go check out One American News, oann.com.
Yes, go follow them, follow Jack's work, because these are the information we all need to know. Thank you so much again, Jack.
Appreciate it so much, Annie. Love the opportunity.
And for those of you who joined our webinar, or if you're watching this afterwards, thank you so much for being with us. Remember, all of these webinars are brought to you for free by David Hurwitz Freedom Center. So if you'd like to continue watching them, consider going to frontpagemag.com and making 100% tax deductible donation to David Hurwitz Freedom Center so we can continue on educating you on important topics. You all stay safe and we will see you next week.